behalf of the Greenwich League, I just want to welcome you all tonight. Thank you all for coming out. We're going to have a very interesting discussion about fixing Connecticut's finances with the co-chairs of Connecticut's Commission on Fiscal Stability and Economic Growth. My name is Deirdre Kamlani, and I'm a member of the League's board and program committee. We're delighted to be presenting this event tonight in partnership with the Greenwich Library. You're in for a real treat this evening. I have had the pleasure of hearing our speakers talk about their findings and recommendations earlier this year, and they do an incredible job of making complex material very accessible. And this topic, our state's fiscal outlook, is one that every voter needs to know about, especially given the very consequential election we have coming up on November 6th. We hope that your time with us tonight will help you become more informed voters, better able to evaluate the different economic plans being proposed by candidates for state office. We're also pleased to welcome our state legislative delegation, Senator Scott Franz, and Representatives Fred Camillo and Mike Pacino. Is Libby here? No? Oh, well, all right, good, hopefully. Along with their challengers, Alex Bergstein, Laura Costin, and Stephen Meskers. We're very lucky to have the Commission's co-chairs here with us, Jim Smith and Bob Petroselli. They're in great demand, and they've spent time with our legislature, but also with groups of citizens all around our state since issuing their report in March. They spearheaded a bipartisan team made up of 14 private citizens with long and distinguished careers in business, public service, and academia. Their goal is to identify Connecticut's fiscal challenges head-on and make specific recommendations to address them. There's been so much interest in this event that we've posted the full bios of our speakers and our moderator on our website, lwvg.org, along with the Commission's full report and their recent op-ed in the Hartford Current. Since Jim and Bob have such extensive bios, I hope they won't mind that I share the highlights with you tonight and refer you to our website for more detail. So let's welcome them. Jim Smith is chairman of the board of Webster Financial Corporation and Webster Bank. He joined Webster in 1975 and was appointed CEO of the bank and holding company in 1987 and chairman in 1995. Jim also serves as vice chairman of the Mid-Sized Banks Coalition of America. He's a past member of the board of the American Bankers Association and the Financial Services Roundtable. He also advised the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, served on the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and the executive committee of the Connecticut Bankers Association. In addition to his work as co-chair of the Commission on Fiscal Stability, Jim is also actively engaged in community service and supports numerous civic organizations. Bob Petroselli has spent over 50 years of leadership roles in the healthcare industry, the federal government, and civic organizations. He was the founder of Value Health, which he and his team grew from a startup to Fortune 1000 company in 10 years. Bob also founded and led Evolution Benefits and Women's Health USA, and he served in a variety of positions at Cigna, culminating as president of its healthcare group. Bob's career in government spanned 3 administrations, where he took on numerous roles, including Deputy Undersecretary for Policy at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Bob also serves on a variety of business and nonprofit boards, and he has had a lifelong interest in public policy. Our moderator tonight is League member Nancy Cooper. Nancy currently serves on the board of directors of Aptiv, Brunswick Corporation, Guardian Life Insurance, and Mosaic Company. Prior to her board engagements, Nancy had a 35-year career in technology businesses. She was the CFO of CA Technologies and IMS Health and a partner at General Atlantic. She also spent 2 decades in financial executive positions at IBM. Nancy serves on the representative town meeting, and as a League board member in 2014 and 2015, she ran a series of educational programs about Connecticut's future fiscal problems, highlighting the budget deficit and unfunded pension liabilities. So we could not have a better moderator for our discussion tonight. So what's the plan? Well, we'll have each of our panelists speak. I think in total they'll speak for about 40 minutes, and after they finish, they'll be joined by our moderator back on stage who will kick off the Q&A. We'll have microphones stationed at both sides of the auditorium, so you can ask all your questions, and we've allowed a lot of time for Q&A. So I'm delighted to turn the podium over to Bob Petroselli, who will speak first. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you, Deidre. Thank you to to the league, Nancy, and all of your colleagues, and to all of you for coming out tonight. And thank you also for the 4 sitting members of the General Assembly and their challengers for coming out. We never want to miss a chance to communicate our message to people who are engaged in public life. Let me start by saying I think what we are all engaged in, you and Jim and me, is a grand experiment in civic education. And it isn't easy. And we're literally and figuratively, we're doing it in a rainstorm. And the rainstorm is a general election. I think it's worth dwelling for just a moment on how this all started. It started back in the spring of 2017 when a group of friends in the Hartford area business community, by and large, got together. Many of us, like me, had had some previous government experience. And we were dimly aware that the state was having great problems and feeling like the business community wasn't paying enough attention to it. And this is all happening on our watch. What are we doing about it? This is a kind of leave room voters question. And after several months of deliberating, we approached the governor with the idea that perhaps the state needed something like a Simpson-Bowles Commission, a private commission of business and other leaders. Sounds like I just lost the mic. There we go. Business and other leaders to work on our principal problems. And the governor said he would support it, but only if the legislative leaders did also and took the lead. And remarkably, in the space of an hour's meeting, 6 Republican and Democratic leaders agreed to charter the commission. It was enacted by statute in the 2017 budget legislation, beginning of October 2017. 14 of us were appointed. We're a very focused charge. Our focus is on bringing sustainable fiscal stability to the state and stimulating and reigniting economic growth. We are not investigating all of the state's issues and problems. It's fiscal stability and economic growth. That's why we have such a boring name. It's hard to make an acronym. And without going through chapter and verse, we had actually 76 days from the time we were all appointed in December until March 1 when our report was due. And we delivered that report on time, and I think had an excellent set of reactions from the public at large, from the editorial boards, and generally from leadership in the General Assembly and from the government. There's a little moral to this story, which is one of the great things about Connecticut is leaders in the private sector get organized. They can get a hearing. It remains to be seen whether they can make something happen. And that's why we're here tonight. But we can really start to move the ball. Can you imagine trying to do that in New York State? Yeah. This is a small state where people know each other. And civic action can be effective. So we're here to help energize you, not that any of you really need that. I'm not going to go into all that we have done, nor really review materials in our report on our goals. Let me tell you instead what we'd like to do tonight. Jim is going to present to you what we call the burning platform, the state of the state. And his job is to get you mad. It's not enough to understand the problems. need you to feel guilty that you and we let 3 decades go by in which these problems were developing and we weren't an effective countermeasure. It's our state. We need to be a little mad about that. And my job is going to try to describe our recommendations and to tell you there's hope, because there is a way out of this mess. And then we hope to, in fact, save as much time as possible for your questions and your action. And I'm happy to tell you some plans we have for continuing the activities of the now defunct commission. So with that, let me, with special personal pleasure, introduce my co-chair, Jim Smith. The best decision I made and we all made was to recruit Jim away from his job as CEO of Webster, accelerate his retirement perhaps, but no one could have a better co-chair than Jim Smith, and Jim is the master of what we call a burning platform.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here tonight, and thank you all for coming out to hear our story, which is to talk about the burning platform as well as the solutions, which taken holistically can change the course of Connecticut's future, put us back on the path to growth and prosperity. I want to start by thanking the League of Women Voters for inviting us, but more importantly for all the good work that you do for empowering voters in this troubling time in our country that's so very important.
Sound.
Microphone.
Don't be.
Do I need the mic, Toby?
Yes.
You don't want me to start over probably, right? But again, I want to thank the League of Women Voters for the great work that you do in this community and across the United States, empowering voters and defending democracy and, educating people on the issues and making people understand that with freedom comes responsibility. And during this troubling time for our country, your role is ever more important. So thank you for that. I also, just thinking about our commission, it's the first time in a long time that you had the private sector represented and, in effect, asked by the executive and the legislative branch, largely due to the work of our head rascal, as we call Bob, to make these proposals that we'll be talking about tonight. And then to have a mandated vote on the recommendations of the commission, which has allowed us to keep it alive, even though we technically disbanded at the moment that we submitted our report on March 1. So for the last 7 months and a day, we have continued our efforts as volunteers because we knew that when we delivered the report, the action would just be started. And the ability to talk to groups across the state, whether it's legislators or civic groups or accountants or lawyers or whoever it is that wants to learn more about what's happening, that's part of our mission. Because with education comes enlightenment and the likelihood that better decisions will be made. And the last slide that you saw up there before this one actually showed that in the world of Connecticut today, that the single most important thing we can do is achieve fiscal stability. Because in order to have economic growth, we have to reinstill confidence in people that create jobs and invest capital and look for returns on that capital. And require some form of certainty and reliability and a sense that long-term things will be okay. And that the government will be able to facilitate an environment that induces economic growth. And we don't have that right now. So when people say, well, when you talk about fiscal stability and economic growth, which is the chicken and which is the egg? In this case, it's pretty clear that fiscal stability is the chicken. And you have to have that stability. And one of the things that we pledged to do was that it would not be at the expense of the safety net. The safety net would remain strong. And no matter how much spending we took out, it would be by reducing inefficient spending and fraud and waste. And I know you hear that a lot, but if you automated a lot of the services of the state, or if you had procurement across a broader base and we leveraged our capabilities, there's lots of ways to take out dollars on the spending side. And then our guiding principle was competitiveness. And so everything we did was with an idea toward looking at neighboring states, looking at competitor states, looking at aspirational states, and saying, what is it they've done so we can learn from that and make good recommendations that therefore will stimulate the rate of economic growth. And if you're able to do that, you're going to have higher revenue growth, which will fund expenses, and that comes right back to the middle of that slide, which shows what economic prosperity and high quality of life is really all about. But in order to drive the point home, we had to make sure that people understood the inescapable, irrefutable facts of our current position. As one author said, it may have been Jim Collins, I think, that you have to be willing to face the brutal facts of your current reality while never giving up faith that you can overcome those obstacles. And that's where we came from. We're optimistic people. We believe in Connecticut. We're from here. We raised our families here. My dad started Webster Bank back in 1935 as a savings and loan association in Waterbury, Connecticut, to help people buy and build their homes. And his middle name was Webster. And our main office is 3 blocks today from where it was 83 years ago. And we're proud of that. Bob has a similar story. And all the people that came together to make these recommendations, we believe in the future of Connecticut, but we have to lay it out there so that people understand how tough things are, so that it will galvanize us to get together and make the tough decisions that are required to get Connecticut back on the road to growth. So we're going to talk about these issues, such as the fact that our real gross state product has lagged the national rate and the regional rate. People say, well, we're all demographically challenged, everybody's got the same problem. Well, we don't. I'll show you a slide in a minute that drives home that point. And that our personal income is ranked in the bottom quintile again and again and again, which means that we're losing revenue that otherwise could have helped us to balance the budget and would be the result of and a stimulant for economic growth. That our economic competitiveness has collapsed over the last 12 to 15 years. Our deficits are growing at around $500 million a year because of the cost of funding the liabilities that were taken on by legislatures and governors past. The obligations they took on were higher than they rationally should have, and then they failed to pay them up along the way. And then we'll talk about fixed expenditures are taking over the budget. We now have $100 billion if you did a true calculation of what all the unfunded liabilities and debt is. And to Bob's great point, if there's 1 million homeowners in Connecticut, that's like having a $100,000 mortgage on every single person's house to pay for those previous liabilities. We're underinvesting in Connecticut's transportation infrastructure. And without that, that's the backbone of our economy. We're not going to be able to move forward. We have some fairly controversial recommendations there, including the consideration of tolling, which we know is not popular in a lot of quarters, but we can back it up. And then our city's high reliance on property taxes is a big liability to them. And we'll talk a bit about that. So let me get into it. If I could only have one slide to talk about the burning platform, this is the one that I would use. Because it shows that it isn't about being demographically challenged. These are other northeastern states. Connecticut is the only state on this chart that has negative real GSP growth, down 9.1% in the last 10 years. The rest of New England, without Connecticut, is up 12%. That's a 20+% gap. If you apply that to a gross state product of $250 billion, that means we left $50 billion of growth on the table in the last 10 years. And if you apply a factor to that in terms of what kind of revenue do you generate, let's say we use 4%, because a lot of that is sales and other income that would generate taxes along the way. That's $2 billion of annual revenue lost because we are underperforming the average New England state. $2 billion, which is the size of the projected deficit in 2020. Just that alone, if we were more competitive, would have allowed us to keep pace with others. This is the cost. This is cause and effect. On the one hand, it's because of a lack of confidence, and businesses aren't being expanded here, and people aren't coming here to start their businesses. And they're leaving in droves. And the people that live in this county are probably leaving faster than those in other counties. And the people at the high end of the income scale that have the mobility to leave are leaving. And so one of the things we have to do is stabilize the base before we can grow. And that's where fiscal stability comes in, and Bob will be talking about some of those recommendations. But this is the slide. 9 of the last 10 years, negative growth. 9.1% negative versus an average of plus 12 or 13. This is personal income. We're at the bottom there at 1.5%. People say, well, at least we're growing. The national average was 3.1. The difference between 1.5 and being average is around $4 billion worth of revenue. And if you tax that income at 5%, that's $200 million a year. So that means that the deficit is growing by $200 million a year on top of the other stats that I cited. This is what actually happened, where we used to be competitive on the left-hand side. You can see revenues growing actually faster than the nation. And when things got bad in the Great Recession, that's when people realized how tough things were in Connecticut as compared to other states. As Warren Buffett says, when the tide goes out, that's when you find out who's not wearing a bathing suit. Right? And Connecticut was not wearing a bathing suit, and we haven't apparently put it back on yet, because our performance has not improved relative to the average. This is the embedded deficit that we're looking at going forward. It's going to be $2 billion in 2020. If you take out what are called structural revenue, it's all the gimmickry that goes on. The actual run rate embedded deficit is over $1 billion, and it's growing at $500 million a year. And the reason is because if you look at those general fund expenditures across the bottom, if this thing works, you can see that in the period 06 to 20, they were growing a little under 5%. And the bottom right-hand corner there says that in the period 17 to 20, they'll grow at 6%. This is in a state whose revenue is growing at 1% or less, and we can do the math. And what's happened is they're growing at such a rate that even though discretionary spending is under control, they now comprise almost 53% of the total budget. And this is debt service and entitlement programs and the payments that are due on unfunded liabilities. And if you can't solve that problem, how on earth are we going to invest in the future when you have that plus the $2 billion deficit that's growing at $500 million a year? This is the inescapable, irrefutable fact that we're trying to deal with by aggregating all this information. This simply shows that we've got massive unfunded liabilities and debts. This is where the $100 billion came from. On the right-hand side of this chart, you can see that we're virtually last in every major category in terms of what our comparison is to other states if we're talking about debt service to revenue or pension contributions required, which now comprise about 26% of revenue overall. This is the teacher retirement system, which left unchecked will grow to cost $4.2 billion, $4.7 billion by 2032, up from $2.7 billion now. And we have a recommendation that actually will take that number down very significantly, will contribute assets to the teacher retirement system, and will reduce the unfunded ratio, improve the funded ratio, in other words, lower the annual required contribution, in exchange for which we expect that there will be a hybrid plan put into place. This is the tax schedule right now. I'm not going to get into this except to say you can see that our taxes are relatively high in a lot of categories. We're actually off the charts when it comes to personal income taxes. There's only 12 or 14 states left in the whole country that have an estate tax, and Connecticut's the only one that has a gift tax. This is such an irritant to people. It's a poke in the eye. It only raises $150 million, and it's driving people out of state. And with them goes their job creation, the revenue that they're going to pay. I think 357 families in Connecticut pay 12% of all personal income taxes. So when they leave, it makes a loud noise. And they take their families, they take their philanthropy, they take their company, they take their future away because they're being driven out because we haven't stepped up to face our fiscal challenges. This just shows what's happening with the workforce development, where in the bottom left, those are the most important jobs, and we're not training the workforce that we need to take them. In the top left, those are the lowest paying jobs, and we have a surplus of workers. We need to better connect workforce development to our universities, get a stronger workmanship together to address those problems, to create the workforce that Connecticut needs. Lots of jobs are going out of state because we simply don't have a supply of trained workers to take them. Not just because we're in fiscal crisis right now, but just because we're not training the workers. This is transportation, and every time I come down here, I think about this slide and about how are we going to address this. What that says is the wait times are 5 times as much as they were about 25 years ago, and that our transportation system is over-reliant on highway. They're barely in a state of good repair. We're underinvesting by billions of dollars a year in transportation, and it's really going to be very hard to balance a $2 billion deficit and invest in transportation, the backbone of our infrastructure, at the same time, without thinking in terms of dedicated revenues to go into the transportation system to make it more competitive with every other state on the Atlantic seaboard, even as you make sure that it manages itself in a more efficient manner. So we want to have more reliance on rail, more reliance on ports, better development of those airports, for example. We ought to be able to get to New York in a much faster time. You've heard 30, 30, 30, right? What matters in Connecticut? You've got to get from Stamford to New York and back. You gotta fix those bridges, you have to be able to get to Penn Station, then you gotta be able to get from New Haven to Stamford, Hartford to New Haven, and you have to prioritize those projects, those initiatives, and then deprioritize other things. How often do you hear the word deprioritize in government? We need to hear it a lot more, because we have limited resources to invest in the most important investments to help get us back on the track. Without better transportation, there's no hope we're gonna keep our kids. Think they're gonna wait for all that time in traffic coming down Route 95? So my story is that most of the time when I come down 95, I realize that it's taking me from Waterbury, Connecticut, down here, it's about 45 miles. It usually takes me a little over an hour and a half, so that's around 30 miles an hour that I average. I think it's probably closer to 26. But when I get down to 95, I slow down to something like 14 or 15 miles an hour for the balance of the trip. So I realized that I could ride my bike faster than that. And so I have this whole plan now where, you know, they got the concrete barrier in the middle and there's plenty of room there. We could all get our bikes, ride and come down. We could do the decongestion thing that way. And then we could wear our easy passes and our helmets. We would actually get credits for the miles ridden on our bikes while opening up the highways to everybody else. Now, is that innovative? Right? That's called thinking out of the box. So clearly, we need higher frequency of rail in particular. We need fewer stops. It's got to be faster, more reliable, and we can make that happen. And these are our core cities, you know, urban, isolated areas that are over-reliant on a single tax. It's the property tax. They're not supported by all the other towns around them. They're providing service to all those towns. They're not getting paid for that. And they've got about 40% of all their property is tax-exempt property. So how are they going to compete to bring in businesses, let alone residents, when they don't have the ability to invest at all in themselves? And they're running property tax rates as high as the 70s, 60s, 50s, when their neighboring communities are in the 20s and the 10s. It's not viable. It has to be addressed. And one of the things we have to have is a better urban policy and the ability of municipalities to be a little bit less dependent on that property tax for their overall revenue and more able to invest in their future. So I mentioned the education and training mismatch that has to be addressed, which we do in our proposals, that if you look at how do we run our government, the reason they need the Fiscal Stability Commission is because life is about next year's budget and a 2-year election cycle, when it ought to be about long-term structural reform and making policies in the context of what's going to happen longer term, so that we can better invest the precious resources that we have. And yet we have an appropriations committee that's over here, and by the way, it's all structured, not necessarily by the legislator's own choice in many cases. We have our Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Commission over here. We need to have them work more closely together by having something like a budget review committee that can establish at the outset, what are the parameters for budgeting? What are the priorities? That word again, what are the priorities for budgeting? What are the revenue limitations that will be involved in budgeting? We're not doing that today. And that's so we need structural reform, organizational reform, capital reform, spending reform. On every level, we need to remake the government in order to achieve fiscal stability and drive economic growth. Regulatory environment, I mean, I guess we've got 300 taxes on small businesses, of which 200 collect less than $20 million all in. We've got to be able to get rid of some of that. We need to have a commission of some sort that Bob may talk about that would reduce that regulatory burden, because everybody hates doing business here because the regulations are so difficult. We have it within our power to change this. So I'm going to turn it back over to Bob now, but I just want to make the point again about how optimistic we are. I want you to know that it's true. That these are the brutal facts of our current reality, which we have faith that we can change, and we know that our recommendations will help to do that. We've got a great location. We have a lot of natural resources, beautiful K-12 schools, educated workforce. The problem is that all those things are going to diminish in terms of their rankings because of all the other bad things that are happening here. It's like resting on laurels that are dwindling, that need to be resuscitated as a result of the good choices that we make. But I will say that we have seen the seeds of structural reform. If you look at what happened in the last legislature, that we were able to see the makings of a volatility cap and a revenue cap and a bonding cap, a spending cap. Finally, after 26 years, we have a spending cap, and we're really excited about that because that's the beginning of the kind of structural reform that will put us back on the path so that Bob's proposals, taken together, will change the course of Connecticut's future. Thank you.
Well, are you a little bit mad?
Yeah.
You should be, and nobody does this better than Jim. Well, he may be a hard act to follow, he's a great act to follow, because you're ready to hear about how we can dig out of this. We made 35 or more recommendations in the report. You will be pleased to hear that I'm not going to take this for 35 recommendations. You were given, I believe, a one-pager on the way in that listed 10 of the key recommendations. I'm probably even going to talk about maybe 6, because you need to understand these a little more in depth than 9. But let me start by saying, where are we going with this? The commission formally, as Jim said, went out of business on March 1. But we may be defunct, but we're not dead. And we never believed we were going to get much enacted in a short legislative session before an election. So in fact, the timing is great. And we want to take advantage of it by probably issuing a commission report 2.0 after the election as guidance for whoever's elected as governor and the new General Assembly. So what you're going to hear tonight are some modifications in our original report that are likely to find their way into 2.0. Let's start with tax reform. And this is one of the 5 or 6 key areas that I'd like to emphasize. Pro-growth, revenue-neutral tax reform. That's where we still are in our recommendations. We made a very aggressive proposal to take over $2 billion out of personal income tax at all brackets, lowering tax rates from 18 to 30% in the various brackets, and then to try to make that up principally with expansion of the base in the sales tax and a small increase in taxes on corporations. But it was a very bold proposal designed to attack frontally what we think is the most anti-growth element of the state's tax regimen, which is the unusually high levels of personal income tax. We are modifying that recommendation, likely to modify that recommendation. And we think we can do so without sacrificing any of our goals. First of all, rather than adding an additional tax on business, after talking to a lot of people, we think it would make more sense to try to get our business tax regimen among the better ones in the country. We're now rated in the bottom 10 in terms of our business friendliness, in terms of the tax climate. And so we would take a new tax on business off the table and instead lower the corporate income tax rate and do some things around net operating loss carry forwards, elimination of capital stock basis. This is all going to sound in the weeds to you, but there are a number of areas in our tax code on corporations that make Connecticut uncompetitive compared to other states. And that's got to be have very high priority. We would lower the top rates in the personal income tax system. And we think a particularly onerous element of our income tax system, not found in other states, is the so-called recapture, which many of you are probably familiar with, but when you get above a certain level, $200,000 as a single filer, $400,000 as a joint, your entire tax bill is recast to the top rate. So instead of paying a graduated rate up to $200,000 or $400,000, you go right to the top rate 6.99 for your entire income. That recapture provision was only added, I believe, in 2015, a while ago. Other things we would do, we would get rid of the gift tax. And again, under the heading of competitiveness, the juice is not worth the squeeze on the estate tax. We're one of 13 states that still has an estate tax. We should repeal it. It's only going to produce about $150 million a year by 2020. It doesn't pay for itself in terms of the damage it causes. On the sales tax, we are working with outside experts to try to find ways to broaden the base of the sales tax. We now cover very few areas of services, even though over 70% of our economy is services, not goods, at retail. So we need to expand the base of the sales tax. Let me move past taxes to savings. We said let's take $1 billion out of the state's roughly $20 billion general fund. We still believe that. We said let's get a first-class consultant in. Some of this is savings, some of it is revenue optimization. You'll be interested to learn that we collect only 58% of the sales tax possibility. Every percent we could get that up is worth $70 million. So we proposed hiring a major consultant. That's been done. The RFP has been published. Companies have bid. And so the next Governor and General Assembly can implement that. That's one of the big 5 or 6 recommendations. The teachers, I'm not going to have time to go into this, but the teachers' retirement system, as you remember from one of Jim's charts, is going to bankrupt us all by itself because of the hugely climbing TRS, as it's called, pension liabilities. We made a comprehensive proposal. That's one of the big 6. That's got to get enacted. It may surprise you to learn that the state pays 100% of the cost of pensions and a third of the cost of retiree health care for those local employees. It's not a municipal expense. The state somehow took that on. Another one of the big 6 is labor agreements. I'm not going to go into detail here, but you know from Jim's charts about how fixed costs are eating up the budget, that decades of non-payment of unfunded liabilities are probably the single biggest fiscal issue we have. There's a deal to be had here. While we have put aside $30 billion in general obligation debt, we have $70 billion in state employee and teacher unfunded liabilities. Our pension plans are funded at roughly 30% of requirements, and hence the overhang. Around the country, the average is around 60%. We don't have to get to 100%. What would it take to get us to 60%? Well, on the teacher side, we've made such a proposal. We said dedicate the proceeds of the state lottery for 30 years to the teacher's pension fund. That's worth about $7 billion. That would take that pension plan out of the dungeon and make us competitive with other states. It would take $14 to $15 billion to do the same thing with state employees. And the answer to that is to take other state assets or income streams and dedicate them to the state employer pension and get up to 60% and get out of the dungeon in terms of rating agencies, get our unfunded liabilities down. But there's got to be a quid pro quo for that. And right now, our state employee pension plans are too rich, and the next governor must and here's something that you can do, prevail on whoever is the next governor, must reopen the state employee deal that was cut in 2017 for 10 years. We proposed an increase in the minimum wage. I'm not going to go into that in great detail. It's perhaps not one of the big six. It's got a life of its own. It's a standing debate in the General Assembly, but important. You can't live on the state minimum wage of $10.10 an hour in Connecticut. You just can't. We proposed modifying the structure of the legislature to some extent. This is not one of the big six. We'd rather have the legislature that's coming in focus on the fiscal and economic growth issues rather than fixing itself. Maybe this is a year two issue. And I'll give you one little known fact. There are hardly any large company or senior business people left in the General Assembly. There are only about 35% of the 187 members of the General Assembly who are in companies, even as workers. I'm not talking about CEOs or senior officers. There is in fact only one mid-level senior officer, and that's from Webster, in the General Assembly. Our General Assembly is made up of lawyers, realtors, educators, not-for-profit employees, labor leaders, and 35% scattered around in private business, including small business people. Folks, we gotta make it honorable again for business people to be in the General Assembly. One last thing I'm going to touch on, it is one of the big six. We have got to fix the labor supply in our state. And we're going to be calling for, in contrast to our original proposal, a significant infusion of new state funds into STEM scholarships coupled with loan forgiveness for millennials who work in the state, STEM educated loan forgiveness for at least 5 years. Oh, I guess I have to talk a little about transportation. Jim did some of that, and he told you about reprioritizing, and that's critical. But here's where we have to pick a fight with our General Assembly friends, and frankly, especially with our Republican friends, and we're staunchly nonpartisan on the commission. We are going to have tolls. We are the only state on the Atlantic seaboard that tolls are not a tax. Tolls are a user fee. User fees are intelligent. They're smart. And somehow when we get past the Sturm and Drang of the general election and get back to rationality again, that discussion on tolls must happen, because without fixing our transportation infrastructure, we're not going to get economic growth. So there are other things here. This chart right here is one of our favorite. It says if you did everything we recommended, you'd fix the structural budget deficit. And without fiscal stability and business confidence in fiscal stability, there will not be significant economic growth. So whatever your recipe is for fiscal state, you gotta have a chart like this at the end point. So let me stop there, folks, and we'll take on your questions. I'm sure that one of them is, what can we do? And I suppose you could start by making sure that the 8 current and prospective members of the General Assembly who are here tonight don't leave before midnight. So with that, let me step down. Thank you very much for
to the Q&A portion of the agenda, and we will take questions from the floor. I get reserved the right to ask the first question. The mics will be handed to you, And one thing I ask you all is ask a question. We don't need statements, we need questions.
And you fix your microphone.
Is it not working at all?
Yeah.
Dr.
Give me a
Andrews?
minute, please. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Okay, so now can you hear me? We're in the Q&A portion of the agenda. I'm going to ask the first question, and then we'll take questions from the floor. And I would ask everyone to make sure you ask a question, because we would like everybody to be able to participate in this exchange. So my first question has to do with, we'd like to know who is involved in addressing the items that Bob laid out on the... And how will the process be known to the public when this is done in January? So maybe...
You want to take that, Jim?
And how we're looking out?
Yes.
So there actually are people that are working on this now voluntarily, people like Bob and me who are running around talking to everyone that will listen to us because we believe to our core that it's important and we have a high responsibility to educate people so they'll be better equipped to advocate and demand change. One thing that's happening is that we've gotten into the legislative process. And I just want to reemphasize that there were some green check marks up there. So here we were in the second year of the biennium and an election year where there was a rainy day fund surplus that came about that could cover the deficit. And yet we still were able to get some things into the bipartisan budget, such as a review of that tax study, a revenue neutral pro-growth tax change that would have less demand on the personal income tax and a broader base for the sales tax, a consumption tax, which is better tax policy, which, while being revenue neutral, will drive growth and therefore generate revenue faster and stimulate confidence faster than we have today. So we're very excited about the fact that there's a study that's going on and that both sides of the aisle are actually very interested in that study, and we've had the privilege of working with some of the leaders, including Scott France, which we appreciate. And then there's another piece, which is, Bob was talking about the teacher retirement system. Both sides of the aisle are very interested in that, that if you could add assets to the plan, improve its funded ratio, lower the annual required contribution, in exchange for a hybrid defined benefit, defined contribution plan for unvested and new teachers going forward, and a benefit share, a risk share on the performance of the investment so that the beneficiaries have to share in whatever the downside of that would be, and also higher employee contributions for healthcare. I mean, there's a plan, that could work, and that the fact that that is being studied is also heartening to us. We recommended $1 billion in spending management improvement, and they have indicated that they'll go after $500 million. I think there is one part of the story that I think I have to say in my most nonpartisan way, which is that in the end we were very fortunate to have the support of the Republican leadership, namely Glenn Pisano and Dennis Claridis and Scott France, who ensured that these elements got into the Republican budget bill that ended up being the bipartisan bill that was adopted by the legislature. We're very appreciative of that.
Great, okay, so now we're open for questions. The mics are on the side of the room. First question, right here.
Thank you so much for recommending lowering the corporate income tax. As a former GE employee, I might be the only former GE employee in this room, so it certainly means a lot to me to hear that from you as one of your 2.0 recommendations. My question for you is about something that I did not see in the report, which is investment in freight rail as a way to free up our highways and reduce our carbon emissions. Is that something that you looked at or didn't find it to be viable for Connecticut?
Yes, so we looked at it. I won't say we looked at it in great depth, but we recognize that getting rail off the road, getting freight off the road and onto the rails would be a massive improvement in opening up the transportation infrastructure. So there's an appendix, I believe, that on transportation that may not get into it in any detail, but does acknowledge that there are many ways to improve that transportation infrastructure and get cars and trucks off the road. Of course, one aspect of this too is that tolling for the pass-through trucks, they would create
Yes, thank you. Can you describe in a little more detail what you think will happen to the debt that the state of Connecticut is carrying now? If there's a progressive rise in interest rates, that's going to have an impact as that debt is rolled over. On the other hand, if the financial stability of the state improves, presumably our borrowing costs would go down. How do you see those two factors playing out?
Well, don't you think the banker on the
So I think I'll just say that improvement in Connecticut's fiscal condition would certainly lower the cost of borrowings. Actually, one of the interesting things is kind of almost predictable that when Connecticut decided they'd be helpful to Hartford beyond what a lot of people thought they were going to do, that Hartford ratings went up and the states went down. So obviously the market is very sensitive to where you are on the spectrum. But I do think that the rise in interest rates outright will offset the benefit of a better fiscal condition. So as rates rise, we are going to have to accept the fact that those borrowing costs could increase further, which creates an even higher sense of urgency to deal with all of the issues related to unfunded liabilities today. It makes it unlikely that we can do that without concessions from labor to help to get to a better state.
Could I, can you hear me all right without
Yes.
mic?
Yes.
Could I tag on to that on one point that I think is an alert to all of you. We know that we've got a brutal job ahead of us, the legislature has a brutal job ahead of us to come up with a balanced five-year budget. Probably, when we struck out certain easily changed items, we order $3 billion over the next 2 years. There's going to be a huge tendency to take the $2 billion that's in the rainy day fund and just slap it right in there and pretend they solved the problem. That's not what the rainy day fund is for. Can you imagine what will happen to our budget deficit if there's a stock market correction and if we're no longer getting kinds of tremendous capital gains tax that we've seen over the last couple of years? That rainy day fund is there for a reason. So to your point of fiscal sobriety, make sure that our sitting members and our candidates have some answers to the question of how they're going to take $3 billion out of the next biennial budget.
Okay, right here.
Have our two governor candidates listened to what you've done and engaged with you, and how have they reacted?
Well, I will say, we had a lot of conversation with several of the nominees in the pre-primary period. I will say, without trying to play favorites, that David Stemmerman lifted and adopted a large number of our proposals. Of course, we liked that. At this point, we've met with both of the leading gubernatorial candidates. We both know and agree with it well. Respect him. But you know, this may not be the time for, it isn't being taken as the time for rationality, I would say, in the gubernatorial process. Neither candidate is confronting the public with the kind of educational message that needs to be given, the kinds of data that Jim presented. And therefore, I'm disappointed. However, when we come out with 2.0 and the elections behind us, we want to do that early enough to inform the transition plan and the emerging policies of the next governor and General Assembly. So there'll be time. But maybe it's asking too much for the gubernatorial debates right now to be as focused on the problems as they are.
Can I just add that sometimes people say, well, if I really tell people what I'm going to do, I'll never get elected. But we don't subscribe to that. We actually, part of what we've been trying to do is get it into the dialogue on an ongoing basis. And the op-ed piece in the Hartford Current referred to earlier was Bob and me together doing exactly that. And encouraging more debate about the central issues as opposed to what people want.
Well, let's get someone back in the corner.
Thank you for educating us. And I do want to say that I'm not a teacher, but I did hear, and please correct me if I misheard this, but one of your recommendations is to change the pension plans for new teachers from a defined, now it's a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan. Is that correct?
No, it is to a hybrid plan, part defined benefit and part defined contribution to be competitive with other plans in neighboring and what we call competitor states.
I guess my question there is how do you attract excellent talent for the schools if you're taking away that, one of the benefits that teachers have? They are generally underpaid in my opinion, and that is something that other professions don't offer. And so how to have, I think it's more of a long-term, this is a short-term hybrid plan will help the deficit. However, in the long term, is that really what we want? Especially when you're addressing urban issues, inequality. Like, I think taking away from education in the long run is probably not penny wise, pound foolish. Thank you.
We did take that into consideration, and I mentioned before that the single most important driving principle of everything we did was competitiveness, and we made sure that the resulting plan would be competitive with other plans in neighboring states. There actually are a lot of people clamoring to give all state employees, including teachers, 401k plans. And our commission said, you know what, that isn't competitive. Therefore, it's not the right thing to do here. And we're trying to balance the desire to have affordability and something that the state can afford with making sure that the benefits for teachers and other state employees are highly competitive and are not unfair to them in terms of balancing the budget on their backs.
Okay, how about in this corner, over here? This lady right here.
Hi, my name is Dita Barba, and I want to thank, first of all, the League of Women Voters for putting on this very informative session, and I want to thank Jim and Bob and Nancy all for taking up the time to educate us today. I have sort of a twofold question, and Laura Costin had mentioned GE, and I kind of look at them a lot as an example of businesses leaving the state, as you have mentioned. One of the things that GE, the several things that they mentioned as reasons why they left, is the lack of pipeline of talent. And you had said that people in Connecticut are leaving in droves, and I think a big part of those, that group of people are young folks and graduates from colleges. And so my question to you is, as part of the plan, is there something that is a strong proposal for better urban cores? Because young folks and retired folks these days want convenient urban living, and I think when we're competing with New York City and Boston and other big cities, Stamford and Bridgeport and Hartford and New Haven are just not cutting it, and I think that may be an important part of what we need to look at in Connecticut. The other part is transportation and infrastructure, where you mentioned that over and over again. I think tolls are absolutely necessary, and we should not let 50% of our traffic come through our highways and not be a dime. The question is there GE had mentioned that they're an international corporation and they need a strong airport, and going to JFK in the traffic is a real hassle. Is there a plan to expand an airport in Connecticut, either Bradley or New Haven, which could be critical to attach Connecticut businesses to the rest of the country and the world?
Why don't you hand the mic to the lady to your right who's trying to ask?
Well, I guess the central question was that last point about airports, but you certainly got my attention on millennials and urban cores, but just on airports, we did try to address that. We absolutely have to make Bradley a leading regional competitive hub. We proposed this once to get Aer Lingus to open up a route to Dublin. And what can happen is the airlines will respond, and they give us direct flights to LAX and San Francisco and Seattle and the others. They just want a revenue guarantee. And we think that's cheap money, that would pay for itself in terms of bringing business and sustaining business to our area. We also think that both Tweed and Sikorsky ought to be invested in. There's a runway length issue at Tweed, which is easily fixed, but both those airports need to be made effective regional commuter hubs that will really spur the economic development area around them.
Can I take a crack at some of the rest of it there and say that just stabilizing the economy and having it start grow again will create more jobs than we're creating today and will reduce the outflow. So we stabilize the base relatively early on. And when people see the kinds of investments that are being made, they, instead of having negative confidence, they will have neutral, and then we hope eventually improving confidence. If you look through our recommendations, we understand how important the urban areas are to the success of Connecticut. If they can't heal, Connecticut will not be able to grow. So we have encouraged regionalization through some of the incentives that we have there. We certainly have talked about transportation to this point. We talked about making the urban areas less reliant on the property tax as their sole source of revenue. We talked about the payment in lieu of taxes increasing to a lot of the urban areas. So the makings of a more solid future that's less reliant on a single tax that then enables them through regional investment to strengthen the core will, over a period of 5 to 10 years, improve a lot of our cities, we believe, while transportation goes along hand in hand with that. And the combination of those two will certainly improve the overall confidence in our cities and their growth and stability.
Okay, so full disclosure, I do have a vested interest in the teachers' retirement system. But I have a couple, I wanted to clarify, first of all, the statement that the state pays 100% of the pension contributions. You made of the employer's pension contributions, because the employees themselves have always paid their portion of the contribution. So it's not that it's a freebie for all of the employees to get a pension. But the Connecticut public employees also do not participate in Social Security, so that pension is all that they get from afterwards. If they have Social Security credits, they lose them because of the. Okay, I'm coming to it. So my question is, if the only reason why the pension is in trouble is because the state did not pay its share for decades, including the year that Governor Rowland sent us all $50 refund checks. If that's the only reason it's in trouble, why should the teachers be expected to do something in exchange for the state now paying its share? How is that work?
That's a great question. I think we need to address that. And the answer is that it is not just the unfunded liabilities that are a problem. It is the rate at which the liabilities overall are growing. So in the first case, where a lot of times it's not just, so we have the problem of the unfunded liabilities that are taking up a large portion of the revenue every year. But the fact is that overall liabilities are growing at 3 times the rate of the economy.
Because of the debt service.
No, it's not because of it. It's because of the promises that have been made. So it's not just what didn't get paid. It is that the actual liabilities themselves, I'm talking about retirement liabilities, are growing at 3 times the rate of the economy. So it is both. And I also want to make the point that initially the idea of having higher retirement benefits for state employees was based on the fact that they're great public servants, as they are. And I want to be clear that no one's taking off on public employees, and we have deep respect for the contributions that they make and how important they are to the economy. But we're being straightforward about what the issues are. And that's why we have to make sure we address it. So as it turns out, the overall wages and salaries, because of the sort of a vicious cycle here of the state employees, are higher than surrounding neighborhood states. And if you look at the combination of the wages and salaries and the retirement benefits, they're higher than the private sector in Connecticut and higher than all of the public states around us. So it isn't just the unfunded liability part, it is the overall cost of the wages and salaries and the benefits to those employees.
I think that applies to the state employees, but not necessarily to the teachers.
Well, let me tag on here with Jim's answer. First of all, public education is one of the strengths of it. And we are rated, I think, fourth from the top in the country in terms of the strength of our public education system and quality of the workforce. So we really don't want to jeopardize that. However, we do believe that teachers ought to pay their fair share. And of course, they make a contribution, currently 7%, since they're not part of Social Security, 7% of compensation. The average among the 13 states that don't have their teachers getting Social Security is 9.7%. So again, on the principle of competitiveness, shouldn't our teachers actually contribute more? We're not, witness our fiscal problems, we're not so wealthy anymore as a state that we can afford to be on something like that. So one of our recommendations is teacher contribution should increase to the average of the states that don't permit their teachers to take Social Security.
Next question. All right, this gentleman here.
Sure. Where can we find the full text of this study?
It's posted on the league website, the full 65-page report. You go on the website and find it there. And there's probably a few other places you can find it also.
Well, and if you want the blinding beauty of the appendices, which takes us up to 119 pages, go to our not-for-profit adjunct, ctrising.org.
Say it again.
ctrising.org. That was a not-for-profit we created to help fund our activities.
Okay, let's have this lady here.
Great recommendations, but I didn't hear anything on competitiveness and the cost of energy. Could you speak to that?
You know that, just be right up front and say, we recognize that as an area where the state has unusually high costs. We know that those are embedded structurally in some of the factors that have to do with pipeline capacity into Connecticut and the absence of solar opportunity and all the rest. But we didn't look at that, and it really does need to be looked at. Interestingly, though, cost of living and cost of doing business is not a determinant of lack of competitiveness. In one prominent rating, Massachusetts was rated as 50 among the states in cost of doing business, and number 1 in terms of business attractiveness.
Okay, thank you. Let's go the lady in pink in the back.
You spoke to the need to help our cities, and our cities provide services to the surrounding communities. And they also, the residents of cities, as you pointed out, really have a very high burden of property taxes. And my question is, if you, and it's typically the case that the suburbs have the higher income people, so you're cutting the personal income tax. How are you going to accomplish the help to the cities?
So I'll comment that you can't, everything is connected, but I would look at personal income tax would be reduced because it is the most onerous of all taxes. And it is better to tax end consumption than it is to tax income. And we have a relatively higher reliance on personal income tax, lower reliance on sales tax. So you basically lower the personal income tax and pay for it by expanding the sales tax base. That was the proposal that Bob was doing.
Right, but that's pretty well regarded more regressive.
Yeah, but the point is, it's revenue neutral. And while you're doing that, you're also looking at the cities, and you're making allowance to them to be able to earn for the services that they are providing. So they could be able to provide fees for, charge fees for services that they are not charging today. And they also would have fuller funding of the payment in lieu of taxes program, given that the cities have 40% of their property is tax exempt. And the state, in turn, is only paying a fraction of what it is supposed to be paying under the payment in lieu of taxes program. So if they pay more against that program, and if the city's able to assess some fees for the people that are benefiting from the services they're providing, who aren't being charged today, those are two areas of revenue. It will bolster the city and reduce the reliance on property tax.
One of the things we're looking at, having come to a conclusion on in 2.0, is whether we might authorize councils of government to levy an additional half-cent on sales tax for use in particular in distressed municipalities, which there's 17, certainly some in every cog area. But some kind of local option, additional revenue source that might help to deal with the disparity in property tax burdens.
Okay, there's been a hand up in the back.
Yeah, with the new tax code, opportunity zones, are you putting them in your plan 2.0, or have you considered them? I think there's a very good opportunity to move investment to the state here in that area.
Looking at that actually right now. No conclusion.
And hoping for more clarity soon so that it could be introduced as part of the program.
Okay, let's go over here.
Have you considered the state promoting the use of public-private partnerships to finance and develop with private capital infrastructure, airports, and other infrastructure needs of the state?
So we have, as you know, it's been a tool used effectively in a number of other states and metropolitan areas. I think it's gotten a relatively low priority from our current Department of Transportation. It should be expanded. But beyond that, we didn't make a specific.
But we would say, as far as considering it, if I just could throw this in, that would it be a good idea? And if we had had more time, would we have gotten deeper into that? We probably would have, because we see there could be extraordinary value there from tapping into expertise that combined with public investment could significantly improve the return on assets.
There are vast pools of capital.
And there is, yes.
Okay, why don't we go to this lady in the stripe right there?
Okay, so let's not kid ourselves. I don't think the state and business taxes is really, it's kind of de minimis, right? It's not gonna have an impact. The biggest, from my work, basically I've seen this pension reform. Question for you is number one, have you, and biggest being teacher and state employee pension. Sorry, but have you guys talked to the Laura and John Collins Foundation and then worked with Gina at Rhode Island to amend the pension system in Rhode Island? And is that plausible here? Because that, to me, is the biggest issue. We're not gonna, I mean, it's business tax, it's state tax, it's not gonna work.
Well, I've got to tell you, there are several of these issues, and they've all got to be dealt with, but pension reform and what we'll call the public employee labor issues are in our view, generally the top 3 or 4 issues that have to be dealt with. We did make a proposal in the original report that we ought to get out of being one of only 4 states that leaves to collective bargaining the setting for state employees of benefit formulas, investment formulas, and the like. In 46 other states, it's done at the legislative level, and it apparently hasn't worked for us, leaving it to collective bargaining. So, but that said, we have a so-called CBAC agreement that's in place until 2027, and we can't wait for that to expire. So we have to create some mechanism, carrot and sticks, to reopen CBAC. And the state could put assets into the state employee and teacher pension funds, potentially as an attraction to try to rebalance some of the probably uncompetitive elements of the pension funds. Let me mention one other issue, though, that is always underemphasized, and that is post-retirement health care benefits, known as other post-employment benefits, or OPEB. Those are hardly funded at all. I think we pre-funded 2 or 3% of the liability cap. And that's state or municipally funded supplements for Medicare. But that is, which nobody in the private sector has, right? Did your employer give you, if you're in the private sector, give you a retirement benefit that said we'll make up the difference for what Medicare doesn't pay? And who knows what Medicare in the future isn't going to pay? The potential obligation under OPEB is enormous. And frankly, if I could do one thing with our post-employment liabilities of any kind, it would be to get out of, do some flat funding, a dollar amount specific, and get out of writing an open-ended check about retirement health care, because we all know that's going nowhere.
But has your commission reached out to the Arnold Foundation to put out a model for, which they've done for at least 9 states?
No, but we did use 2 sets of very well-established consultants, including Pew Charity Trust, which is probably the leading state pension plan analyst.
Could I just piggyback that and say, we're great admirers of Gina Raimondo. I think she's done a fabulous job in Rhode Island. We've spoken to her at some length about the choices that she made and how she was able to get that done. We also know that the construct in Rhode Island is different from the construct here, and that they have things they can do in their legislature that we're not able to do here because of the contractual nature of the benefits that have been provided. So we have to recognize and respect that difference, even while we're doing our best to suggest what might be done if CBAC were reopened. But it's not within the purview of the commission to be able to reopen it. And so in our report, which concluded that if the commission's recommendations are adopted, we would be able to balance the budget in the out years, where if you go on a status quo basis, there would be a $4 billion deficit in 2025. And so we had to be realistic about what actually could be controlled and not say, bust open CBAC and therefore compute these savings. And what we said in the end was that all of our proposals would have balanced the budget in 2025. And where we could, including in the teacher's plan, which we can't do in the CBAC, we made recommendations for unvested and future employees, which could be a model for what could happen in CBAC. And then we said, even with the balanced budget in 2025, if you were to be able to bring labor to the table to negotiate positive changes there, then you might save another $500 or $600 million a year. And if you were to do some reforms in Medicaid, it would have a value. And if you were to utilize the state's assets more effectively than we are, would have more value. And so what we were saying was not only can you balance the budget, you could create a surplus by adopting the recommendations of the commission and then succeeding in these other areas as well. But we felt our credibility depended upon only making recommendations of things we think could be controlled.
Okay, we have time for one more question, so we'll go to an area we haven't, the gentleman in the back.
First, I want to thank you all for all the work you've been doing on these puzzling questions. And I believe the best job you can create is the job that can't move. And I'm curious to know if anybody in this economic growth sector of the now defunct commission has given any thought to what could be developed, how could Connecticut support it to develop jobs that won't move. A couple ideas. Connecticut aquaculture. I mean, we give licenses off the coast of Connecticut. Those jobs won't move. Yukon developing an aeronautics school.
Ask a question.
Okay, these are just a couple of examples, have you focused anywhere on trying to support or invite people to come in and build these jobs in area-specific places that somebody in your commission has started to focus on?
Well, that seems to suggest that we ought to try to develop a statewide specialty for capital-intensive industry. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think we'll take a job of any kind, but we want to create an environment where employers, large and small, capital-intensive or not, don't want to because we have a more competitive circumstance. But I'd be very willing to hear some detail about where capital investment may be by the state on a bonded basis to stimulate the kind of businesses you're talking about.
This is more about helping people with capital come in and develop these areas and send that some way to bring jobs in, to create jobs locally that can't move.
So that could work, except that at least initially there's no critical mass there. And so we actually think the focus, the best use of the capital would be to identify and focus on our competitive strengths. What are our competitive advantages? So finance, insurance, and real estate still very close to the top of the list. Bioscience, aerospace, precision manufacturing. What are the 4 or 5 core areas where we have competitive advantage? And then invest in those areas so as to facilitate an environment where those organizations can, within that cluster, can take their specialized knowledge and their enhancing productivity and be able to grow and therefore attract new jobs. We think that the yield on the investment could be considerably higher by investing in those core strengths and making them stronger.
Thank you.
Great. So before I thank Bob and Jim, I would like to ask you, what would you advise the group out there, what the things you would like them to do in terms of getting the commission moving forward?
Oh boy, thank you for asking. You've got 1 month to get to work before this election. And every sitting member and every candidate for the General Assembly and any of the gubernatorial candidates that you can get to have to be asked the 3 or 4 central questions that we've already talked about. What is your specific proposal to eliminate $3 to $4 billion of deficit? How do you propose to address $100 billion of unfunded liabilities and debt? Are you in favor of reopening the CBAC agreement? How do you propose to fund our transportation infrastructure? You need to drive these questions home and demand specific answers. I mean, please, elected officials should give us credit for being intelligent people who can understand sometimes difficult messages. And wouldn't we all far prefer honesty on those subjects than
of the program committee. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank Jim, Bob, and Nancy for an energetic discussion on a topic that's really important for our state, particularly in this election cycle. I know that I learned a great deal. I hope you all did too, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you very much. We're also very grateful for the support of the library. The Greenwich Library has been a great partner for us here at the League of Women Voters, and without them we can't do these amazing events. For those of you in the audience who aren't already members, I'd like to remind you that there is an opportunity for you to sign up to become a member. You can pick up one of the brochures and slips out the front, and I'll give you 5 good reasons why you should actually sign up if you're not a member, and I'll run through some of our upcoming events for the next few months. First of all, Wednesday, October 10th, we will have our candidate debates at the Town Hall, Greenwich Town Hall meeting room. That will start at 7 p.m. and that will be the debate for the 36th State Senate District, and that will be with Scott France and Alex Bergstein, which hope you can attend. Followed by at 7:45 the debates for the 150th as well as the 151st General Assembly districts with Mike Pacino and Stephen Meskers, as well as Fred Camillo and Laura Costin. So please do try and attend. They're very important and they're very informative. The next second event that you should sign up and become a League member for is our October 21st event at the Clune Performing Arts Center in Wilton. That will be for the candidates for the 4th Congressional District, and that is Jim Himes and Harry Aurora, where they will debate. Please try and attend those too. They're all very informative and very valuable. This is not a League event, but don't forget to vote on November 6th. But it is a good reason to become a member still. And the 4th is our November 13th event, which is back by popular demand. I'm not sure if you remember, but last year we did put on our first Harvard business case discussion. Fred was there. It was an overwhelming success. We had people from across the community, students and citizens participating. It was oversubscribed. We expect it to be once again. This will be our second case study at the high school. We will be reading and discussing the Martin Luther King voting rights case, which was the most popular choice by the people who participated in the first actual discussion. So remember to go look at that one. It really is a fabulous discussion. Those who attended, I think, sang its praises. We will be doing that on November 13th. And finally, we have our holiday party December 5th, and please join us for some fun. So thank you again, and please continue